April 4, 1945. Central Germany, near the town of Ohrdruf. The Third Reich was collapsing. American forces were advancing rapidly through German territory, liberating towns, capturing prisoners, watching the German army disintegrate in front of them. Soldiers of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, part of General George S. Patton's Third Army, pushed into a small forced labor camp on the outskirts of Ohrdruf. Nothing in months of brutal combat had prepared them for what they found inside. This is the story of what American soldiers discovered at Ohrdruf, what General Patton did when he saw it, and why what happened there became one of the most important moments of the entire war, not for what it changed on the battlefield, but for what it forced the world to finally confront. What was Ohrdruf? Ohrdruf was a subcamp of the larger Buchenwald concentration camp complex, a network of forced labor sites that the Nazi regime had built throughout occupied Europe. Prisoners at Ohrdruf, mostly political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and Jewish inmates transported from other camps, had been forced to work constructing an underground communications facility and rail infrastructure for the German military. Conditions were deliberately brutal. Prisoners were worked to exhaustion on minimal food, housed in overcrowded barracks, and subjected to routine violence from camp guards. As American forces approached in early April 1945, German camp authorities made a decision that would come to define what soldiers found when they arrived. Rather than leave evidence of the camp's operation for the advancing Americans to discover, guards began evacuating prisoners on forced marches towards other camps further from the front, marches that killed many of the weakened prisoners along the way. Those too sick or weak to be moved, along with prisoners guards decided not to bother transporting, were murdered before the camp was abandoned. When the leading elements of the 4th Armored Division entered Ohrdruf on April 4, 1945, they found a camp largely emptied of living prisoners, but filled with the evidence of what had happened there.
What the soldiers found defied description, even for men who had spent months fighting through some of the war's bloodiest campaigns. Roughly 3,200 bodies lay scattered throughout the camp, some in mass graves that had been hastily dug and only partially covered, others left where they had been shot or beaten to death in the camp's final days. Bodies were emaciated to the point of being nearly unrecognizable as having once been living people, the visible result of prolonged starvation. In one area of the camp, soldiers discovered bodies that had been partially burned on wooden pyres, an attempt by camp guards to destroy evidence before fleeing, one that had been abandoned before it could be completed. The smell, according to multiple soldiers who were present, was overwhelming, a combination of decomposition and burned flesh that several men said they could never fully forget for the rest of their lives. Soldiers who had already survived months of combat, men who had seen friends killed beside them, who had grown accustomed to the sights of a battlefield, described Ohrdruf as something categorically different. This was not the aftermath of combat between armed men. It was the deliberate, systematic destruction of unarmed, defenseless human beings, carried out methodically over an extended period of time. Many soldiers present said afterward that no training and no amount of prior combat experience had prepared them for what they encountered walking through the camp's gates. A small number of prisoners had survived by hiding during the evacuation, and they emerged to tell American soldiers what had happened in the camp's final days and weeks, describing the executions, the starvation, and the forced marches that had just taken place. Word of what had been found at Ohrdruf moved up the chain of command quickly. Within days, 3 of the most senior commanders in the European theater arrived to see it for themselves. 3 generals, 1 camp. On April 12, 1945, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, arrived at Ohrdruf along with General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, and General George Patton, commander of the 3rd Army, whose forces had found the camp. It was an unusual gathering, 3 of the most powerful American military commanders in the European theater standing together at a single site. And Eisenhower had specifically requested that Patton, whose troops had found the camp, guide the tour personally. What they saw left a visible mark on all 3 men, but Patton's reaction became the most widely remembered and the most discussed. According to multiple first-hand accounts, including Eisenhower's own later writings, Patton, a man whose entire public persona was built around toughness, aggression, and an almost theatrical refusal to show weakness, became physically ill during the tour. He reportedly stepped away from the group and vomited, unable to continue looking at the piles of bodies and the burned remains in front of him. Eisenhower later wrote that Patton, of all people, the general famous for his hard exterior, was the one who could not stomach what he saw, while Eisenhower himself, forcing himself to examine every detail, described his own face as deliberately expressionless, determined not to look away from anything. Eisenhower later explained his reasoning for pushing himself and his fellow commanders to see the camp in full detail. He said he wanted to be in a position to describe firsthand what he had witnessed, believing that reports alone might not be believed, and that his own eyewitness testimony, backed by that of his senior generals, would carry weight that second-hand accounts could not.
The order. Eisenhower's response to what he saw at Ohrdruf went beyond his own reaction. He immediately ordered that every American unit in the area not currently engaged in combat be marched through the camp to witness it directly. His reasoning, according to accounts from those present, was that soldiers needed to understand exactly what they were fighting against, that abstract talk of Nazi tyranny was different from standing in front of the physical evidence of what that tyranny had actually done to human beings. But Eisenhower did not stop with American soldiers. He gave a further order specifically directed at the German civilian population living in the town of Ohrdruf itself. Local German civilians, including the town's mayor and his wife, were ordered to walk through the camp and view the bodies firsthand. The order was rooted in a specific belief that had become common among Allied commanders as concentration camps were discovered across Germany that spring, that many ordinary German civilians would later claim ignorance of what had been happening in camps located near their own towns, and that forcing direct confrontation with the evidence would make that claim of ignorance impossible to sustain, both for the individuals forced to walk through the camp and for the historical record itself. The reaction from the German civilians forced to tour Ohrdruf was reportedly one of horror and disbelief for many, though accounts vary in how genuine that shock was versus how much had in fact been known or suspected locally. In a detail that became widely reported at the time and that historians have documented extensively, the mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife, after being forced to walk through the camp and view what had been done there, returned home and took their own lives that same night, unable to reconcile what they had seen with their understanding of their own community and their own government. Why Patton's reaction mattered. Patton's physical reaction to Ohrdruf carried particular weight precisely because of who he was. This was a general who had built his entire reputation on projecting toughness, who had less than 2 years earlier slapped and berated soldiers in Sicily for showing signs of psychological distress, who publicly scorned any display of what he considered weakness. For that same man to become physically sick at the sight of what the Nazi regime had done became, for many who witnessed it or heard about it afterward, a kind of unintentional testimony. If even Patton, of all people, could not stand to look at it without being overcome, it underscored just how far beyond ordinary wartime brutality this was. Patton did not write extensively about his emotional reaction in his official communications, consistent with his general reluctance to document moments of personal vulnerability. But those present described his distress as unmistakable and unguarded, a rare crack in the persona he had spent his entire career constructing. Soldiers who had served under Patton for years, who knew him as a commander who rarely showed anything resembling fear or weakness in front of his men, later said the sight of him visibly shaken affected them almost as much as the camp itself, a signal that what they were looking at was something beyond the ordinary horrors of war they had already grown used to.
Documenting the evidence. Beyond ordering German civilians and American soldiers to view the camp, the Allied command moved quickly to create a permanent visual and written record of what had been found. Military photographers and film crews were brought to Ohrdruf and to other camps discovered in the following weeks, generating photographic evidence specifically intended to be preserved for the historical record and for the war crimes trials that Allied leaders already knew would eventually need to take place. Members of the United States Congress and British Parliament were later brought to tour liberated camps for similar reasons, and prominent journalists and photographers were given access as well, part of a deliberate effort by Allied commanders to ensure that what had happened would be documented so thoroughly and witnessed by such a wide range of credible observers that it could never later be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Newsreel footage shot in the camps in the weeks following Ohrdruf's discovery would later be shown in cinemas across the United States and Britain, bringing the reality of the camps directly to civilian audiences who had followed the war from a distance for years. Ohrdruf turned out to be only the first of many camps American and Allied forces would discover in the weeks that followed as they advanced deeper into Germany, including the much larger camps at Buchenwald and Dachau. But Ohrdruf held a specific significance as the first camp encountered by Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton together, and the moment when the shape of the horror to come first became undeniably clear to the very top of the American military command. What it left behind. Eisenhower later wrote that his primary motivation for insisting on seeing Ohrdruf in full and for bringing his senior commanders and ordering troops and civilians through it as well was his concern that the scale of what the Nazi regime had done might not be believed by future generations without overwhelming first-hand evidence. He wanted witnesses, as many as possible, and he wanted that testimony preserved. For Patton, a man who spent the rest of the war projecting the same aggressive, unshaken confidence he always had, Ohrdruf appears to have left a genuine and lasting impression, even if he rarely spoke about it publicly afterward. In private writings following the visit, he described what he had seen in language notably different from his usual bravado, expressing that words could not adequately capture the horror of it. What happened at Ohrdruf on those days in April 1945 became a template for how the Allied command approached the liberation of concentration camps in the weeks that followed. Direct confrontation, thorough documentation, and a deliberate refusal to let anyone, soldier or civilian, look away from what had been done. It remains one of the moments most frequently cited by historians as the point at which the full scope of Nazi atrocities became undeniable to the men who would soon be responsible for rebuilding a defeated Germany and for ensuring the world never forgot what had happened there.